Earlier this month, Vox co-founder Matt Yglesias announced his departure from Vox Media to reclaim what he calls, quote, an independent voice on Substack, where he's launched a new site which is called Slow Boring.
And now another Vox Media co-founder, Ezra Klein, has announced he will also be leaving that platform as well. He's moving, however, to the New York Times. Journalist Zaid Jilani joins us to discuss the upheaval at Vox Media, but more broadly within media in general. It's always great to see you, Zaid.
Good to be here.
Good to see you, man.
So first, just what did you make of these big moves at Vox?
Yeah, it was really interesting in that we saw three of Vox's kind of most senior staff move to other outlets over the past month. There was Matt Yglesias first, who decided to start his own thing at Substack, basically putting out a paid newsletter. There was Ezra Klein, who was, along with Matt, was a co-founder of Vox. He's going to New York Times to write a column. And finally, there's Lauren Williams, who was editor-in-chief at Vox. She actually decided to start a new website covering race and politics, or be part of that community that's starting that website. So it's interesting that one of kind of the largest startup media websites that had so much capital behind it lost two of its co-founders and its editor-in-chief over the past month. And it makes me question whether the people over at Vox thought that their model was viable in the long run, whether they felt like they could express themselves freely. That was an issue, I think, with Matt Yglesias. And whether they felt like, you know, at the end of the day, if legacy media kind of always wins. And the reason I asked that is because, you know, Ezra Klein's a huge name. Having his own website that he founded was a matter of prestige. And yet he still found it more worth it to be part of the legacy newspaper in the New York Times, which has, of course, been around for centuries. So, you know, the question is, you know, is the New York Times kind of building the Voltron of media here, hoovering up other people, and if even Vox Media doesn't feel like it can compete, like you can't beat them, join them.
And Zed, the part that concerns me is that the Columbia Journalism Review is already basically writing precursor articles saying that Substack should cancel some people that are on their platform, you know, people like Andrew Sullivan and Matt Taibbi. They describe them, ironically, along with Matt Yglesias and Glenn Greenwald, as conservative writers. So there are, which is ridiculous, right? Many of them are dissident leftists, but the groundwork for a cancellation campaign like we see against Fox News is being led, and I don't know how that works out. It doesn't seem to me that anybody can withstand that type of criticism. Substack is not Fox News. It's not a multi-billion-dollar corporation which prints money off of advertising. It's a nascent startup, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of, you know, there's a sort of, I think, desire among many liberals. It's interesting because if you go back in the early 2000s, I think many liberals saw mainstream media as generally an opponent of their political project. You know, we had at that time the start of a lot of blogs that today are on Substack, like Andrew Sullivan, Matt Yglesias was blogging at the time, Josh Marshall was blogging, Ezra Klein, Glenn Greenwald was blogging, I think, in the early 2000s. All these people didn't trust the New York Times, didn't trust CNN, they didn't trust these mainstream outlets to represent their view fairly. So they were part of alternative media. You know, they were launching blogs, they were starting to put themselves on streaming platforms. YouTube eventually became a thing. And it's now kind of reversed, where I think progressives and liberals, well, many of them feel like they have a lot of access to things like the New York Times, like CNN or MSNBC. You have people who are on those networks hosting television shows who wouldn't have been a decade ago. So now I think a lot of them have started to feel like they have to defend or, you know, circle the wagons around mainstream media and be more skeptical towards alternative platforms like YouTubers and podcasts and like people starting newsletters through Substack. It's a very interesting reversal, but, you know, my argument is that nature abhors a vacuum. So that if there are things that you're not able to get through the larger, established, well-funded platforms, people are going to go to alternative places. And it doesn't mean that everything in the alternative places is necessarily going to be great, always has wonderful quality control, everything is accurate, but it is fulfilling a need. And I think that much as we were very skeptical of blogs in the early 2000s, is the same way people are being skeptical of podcasts and newsletters now, because they feel somewhat threatened by it, they feel somewhat confused by it, but they're fulfilling an essential need, which is offering views and reporting that aren't being substantiated, aren't being fulfilled in the other places.
It's actually interesting, that split between Yglesias going back to almost like the roots, because all of these people we're talking about, almost all of them started as bloggers. Klein did, Yglesias did, Sullivan did. And so he's almost like, you know what, I want to go back to the roots. And then Klein goes in the exact opposite direction. And it almost feels like that's the split in the choice that you have to make. You either go with one of the giant behemoths, or you're in a position to strike out on your own. And look, it also is the case in the CJR article that was mostly ridiculous, made this point, but it is true. If you already have an established platform, it makes it a lot easier to just go out and strike out on your own and have the confidence that that's going to work out for you financially. So it makes me more concerned about people who are just coming up through the ranks and what the opportunities for new journalists are outside of these giant behemoth corporations.
I think that's absolutely right. So I think that if you look at the Substack, they list the top 25 newsletters. Certainly everybody who's in the top 10 at least are people who've been doing this for a long time, for decades. It's no surprise to me that Andrew Sullivan is one of the top bloggers on Substack, considering that he was blogging in the late 90s, right? He took decades to build up that audience that made it financially viable for him to start up a newsletter, instantly get, 100,000 subscribers or whatever he has. So this is the dilemma, I think, for people who are starting out in the industry, is that what we used to have was a very robust, particularly local news environment. We had so many newspapers. We had advertising that was in a viable model. I think when the internet came around, and particularly when social media came on the scene, a lot of that advertising was monopolized. The rates aren't good enough. A lot of the local newspapers just shut down and disappeared completely. And now you have a lot of consolidation in the media market. And so it's up to newspapers, it's up to really a handful of outlets, national outlets, to take in younger people, to train them up, to help them build an audience and a beat. And when you have a very small group of people doing that, not only do you have fewer spots for people to get into the industry, but you tend to have a consolidation of ideology as well, right? It's harder for people who don't fit maybe into the fashions or currents at the New York Times to get started when there isn't that quality local newspaper that's offering it, or the alt weekly that's offering its own take and perspective on things and on the resources and the training to do it. So yeah, it is a real problem. I do think that the Substacks of the world are a great resource for people who do have that kind of established following and the resources and the training to be able to get out there even when they don't quite gel with what's happening in mainstream outlets. But it's a much bigger challenge as to what we do to bring in newer people and underappreciated voices and people who are just getting their footing, because their alternative seems to be just to go to a handful of currently existing outlets who have the resources to help them establish themselves, but unfortunately just don't have that many jobs anymore because the industry has contracted so much.
Yeah,
I think that's right.
Really interesting. Zed, thank you so much.
Thanks, Zed. Appreciate it, man.
Thank you.
Coming up, Joe Biden is under a lot of pressure to forgive at least some student loan debt. President of the People's Policy Project, Matt Bruning, discusses when Rising returns.